The morning mist clung to Windsor Castle like a gentle embrace, softening the ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of royal secrets. Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic and checked his watch, 6:47 a.m. In 13 minutes, he would begin another day of silent duty, another day of being invisible while standing in plain sight. At 42, James had served the royal family for nearly 2 decades, and he had learned that the greatest skill a royal guard could possess was the ability to become part of the furniture, to hear without listening, to see without watching. But on this particular March morning in 2024, as cherry blossoms began to bloom in the castle grounds, James would hear something that would change his understanding of duty forever. The diagnosis had come like a thunderbolt in January. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had undergone what Kensington Palace described as planned abdominal surgery, but James, positioned outside the private family quarters during those tense weeks, had overheard fragments of hushed conversations between medical staff and senior royal advisors. The word cancer had been whispered behind closed doors, followed by discussions of treatment protocols and the need for absolute discretion. James had stood motionless by the oak-paneled corridor, his face a mask of professional neutrality, while his heart ached for the woman he had watched grow from a nervous new royal into a confident princess. He had been there during her wedding preparations, had seen her gentle interactions with staff, had witnessed her genuine concern for others even when cameras weren't rolling. The morning sun cast long shadows across the state apartments as James took his position near the blue drawing room. The castle felt different lately, heavier somehow, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Staff members moved with particular care, their voices softer than usual, their efficiency marked by an underlying tenderness that spoke of collective worry. Catherine had returned from her hospital stay 3 weeks ago, but her public appearances had been carefully managed and notably brief. James had observed the subtle changes, the way she now paused longer between engagements, how her private secretary had quietly rearranged her schedule to include longer rest periods, the increased presence of medical personnel disguised as additional security. Through the tall windows, James could see the East Terrace garden where Catherine often walked in the early mornings. She had a particular fondness for the rose garden, and James had noticed how she would sometimes stop mid-stride to simply breathe, as if drawing strength from the earth itself. These moments of solitude seemed to restore something in her that the public duties inevitably drained away. The sound of soft footsteps on marble caught James's attention. Dr. Sarah Phillips, Catherine's personal physician, was making her way toward the private apartments, her medical bag discreetly concealed in an elegant leather briefcase. She nodded politely to James as she passed, a gesture he returned with the slightest inclination of his head. Over the years, he had developed a professional rapport with many of the regular visitors to the royal quarters, built on mutual respect and an understanding of the discretion their roles demanded. As Dr. Phillips disappeared around the corner, James reflected on the weight of the secrets he carried. In his nearly 20 years of service, he had become the unwilling repository of countless private moments, family arguments, personal celebrations, moments of weakness, and strength that the public would never see. It was both the burden and the privilege of his position to be trusted with the humanity behind the crown. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of carefully choreographed activities. James watched as various staff members, ladies' maids, private secretaries, security coordinators, moved through their routines with practiced efficiency. But underneath the surface normalcy, he sensed the current of concern that had been flowing through the castle since Catherine's diagnosis. Around 10:30 a.m., Prince William emerged from the family apartments, his face bearing the controlled composure that James recognized from years of observation. William had always been protective of his family, but lately there was an edge to his vigilance, a heightened awareness that spoke of someone preparing for battle. He exchanged brief words with his protection officer before heading toward his study, where James knew he would spend the morning reviewing his wife's medical reports and consulting with specialists about the best path forward. The relationship between William and Catherine had always fascinated James in its genuine affection and partnership. Unlike some royal marriages that seemed built more on duty than love, theirs had a foundation of friendship that had weathered the pressures of public life remarkably well. But serious illness had a way of testing even the strongest bonds, and James had noticed subtle shifts in their interactions, a tenderness that hadn't been there before, a way of touching each other that suggested they were anchoring themselves to something precious and potentially fragile. As the day wore on, James's mind wandered to his own family, his wife Margaret, who worked as a primary school teacher in Windsor, and their teenage daughter Emma, who was studying for her A-levels and harbored dreams of becoming a doctor. Margaret had often asked him about his work, curious about the people behind the public personas, but James had always maintained his professional silence. How could he explain that royalty was, in many ways, just like everyone else when facing illness and uncertainty? The afternoon brought a change in the castle's atmosphere. Word had quietly circulated that Catherine will be making an appearance at a small, private gathering for one of her charitable organizations, her first semi-public engagement since her surgery. James was assigned to corridor duty during the event, position where he could observe the comings and goings while remaining unobtrusive. He watched as Catherine emerged from her private apartments, dressed in a soft blue dress that complemented her complexion, but couldn't entirely mask the subtle signs of her recent ordeal. A slight hollowness around her eyes, a careful way of moving that suggested ongoing discomfort. Yet her smile was genuine as she greeted the small group of charity representatives, and James marveled at her ability to project warmth and engagement despite what she was privately enduring. The gathering lasted just over an hour, but James observed how Catherine paced herself throughout, sitting when possible, accepting offers of tea with what seemed like genuine gratitude rather than mere politeness. Her staff had clearly briefed the attendees on keeping the event brief and low-key, and James noted how smoothly they managed the logistics without making Catherine's limitations obvious. As the guests departed and Catherine retreated to her apartments, James caught a glimpse of her in an unguarded moment. She paused by a window overlooking the gardens, one hand pressed lightly against her abdomen, her face reflecting a weariness that she had kept carefully hidden during the gathering. It was a moment of pure human vulnerability, and James felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came from witnessing private struggles while being powerless to offer comfort. The evening brought its own rhythm to the castle. James's shift was scheduled to end at 6 p.m., but he often stayed later when circumstances seemed to warrant additional attention. Tonight felt like one of those nights. The family was dining privately, and James could hear the soft murmur of conversation and occasional laughter filtering from the dining room, sounds that reassured him that despite everything, there were still moments of normalcy within these walls. As he prepared to hand over his duties to the evening shift, James reflected on the strange intimacy of his profession. He had spent years learning to read the subtle signs of royal stress and contentment, to anticipate needs without being asked, to provide security that extended beyond physical protection to include emotional discretion. It was a calling that required a particular kind of dedication, a willingness to subordinate one's own needs to the service of others, even when those others sometimes forgot that their guard were human beings with families and concerns of their own. The castle settled into its evening quiet, lights beginning to twinkle in windows as darkness approached. James made his final rounds, checking with the incoming shift commander, ensuring that all protocols were in place for the night ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new requirements for vigilance and discretion, new opportunities to serve with quiet dignity. But tonight, as he walked to his car in the staff parking area, James carried with him the image of Catherine by the window, vulnerable, human, facing uncertainty with a courage that had nothing to do with royal training and everything to do with the strength that comes from love and determination. It was a reminder that behind every public figure was a private person dealing with private struggles, and that sometimes the greatest service he could provide was simply to bear witness to that humanity with respect and compassion. The drive home to his small cottage in Windsor Village gave James time to transition from his role as guardian of royal secrets to his identity as husband and father. Margaret would ask about his day, as she always did, and he would give her the same carefully neutral response he had perfected over 2 decades of marriage. But tonight, he found himself thinking about how illness could strike anyone, regardless of their position or circumstances, and how the love of family could be the strongest armor against uncertainty. As he turned into his driveway, James saw the warm light spilling from his kitchen window, where Margaret was undoubtedly preparing dinner while helping Emma with her studies. It was a scene of ordinary domesticity that filled him with gratitude. Gratitude for his family's health, for the stability of his position, and for the trust that had been placed in him by the royal household. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new secrets to guard, but tonight, James Morrison would simply be a husband and father, grateful for the ordinary miracles of family life and mindful of the extraordinary privilege of serving those who had been placed in his care. Spring arrived early at Windsor Castle in 2024, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to mirror Catherine's gradual recovery. By late April, the worst of her treatment was behind her. Though James Morrison had observed the subtle ways it had changed her, a new deliberateness in her movements, a deeper consideration in her choices, and, most remarkably, a heightened intensity in her private moments of reflection. It was during one of these quiet mornings, as James maintained his post near the Queen's Gallery, that he would witness something that would forever change his understanding of royal duty and personal devotion. The early May sunshine streamed through the ancient windows, casting rainbow patterns on the polished floors as Catherine made her way toward the private chapel within the castle grounds. James had been assigned to discreet security detail for what the daily schedule listed simply as private reflection time, a designation that had become more frequent since Catherine's diagnosis. He maintained his position at a respectful distance, close enough to ensure security, but far enough to preserve the privacy that such moments required. The private chapel at Windsor Castle was a sanctuary that few outsiders ever saw, a small, intimate space where royal family members could worship and reflect away from the public eye. Catherine had always been drawn to this quiet corner of the castle, but since her illness, her visits had taken on a deeper significance. James had noticed how she would sometimes spend an hour or more in solitary prayer, emerging with a composure that seemed to come from some internal source of strength. On this particular morning, William joined her, an occurrence that was becoming more frequent as the couple navigated the challenges of balancing public duty with private healing. James watched as they walked together toward the chapel, their conversation too quiet for him to overhear, but their body language speaking of mutual support and shared understanding. The chapel doors closed behind them, leaving James to maintain his vigil outside. The morning was unusually still, with only the distant sounds of groundskeepers tending to the gardens and the occasional call of birds nesting in the ancient eaves. James had learned to find comfort in these quiet moments, using them as opportunities for his own reflection on the privilege and responsibility of his role. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when he heard Catherine's voice, carried on the spring breeze through an open window of the chapel. Her words were soft but distinct, spoken with an emotion that made James instinctively step closer to the window, not to eavesdrop, but because something in her tone suggested this was a moment of profound significance. "I vow to you, William, and to our children, and to this institution we serve," Catherine was saying, her voice steady despite the emotion James could detect beneath the words. "I vow that this experience will not make me smaller, but larger, that it will not make me retreat from service, but embrace it more fully, that it will not make me afraid of the future, but grateful for each day we have been given." James felt his breath catch in his throat. This was clearly a private moment between husband and wife, yet the formal structure of Catherine's words suggested something more ceremonial, more intentional than casual conversation. He found himself frozen in place, torn between his duty to protect their privacy and the practical reality that he was positioned where their words carried to him on the morning air. William's response was barely audible, but James caught the emotion in his voice as he spoke of his own commitment to supporting Catherine through whatever challenges lay ahead. There is something deeply moving about hearing these two people who lived so much of their lives in public view, sharing such an intimate moment of mutual commitment and renewed dedication. Catherine continued, and James realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, a personal ceremony of sorts, a private vow that went far beyond their wedding promises to encompass their shared future in the face of uncertainty. Her words spoke of using her experience with illness to deepen her connection to others facing similar struggles, of finding ways to turn personal challenge into public service, of refusing to let fear diminish her capacity for love and leadership. I vow to return to Windsor in 2026, not as the same person who left for treatment, but as someone who has been refined by difficulty and strengthened by love, Catherine said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I vow to use this chapel as my sanctuary, this castle as my anchor, and this marriage as my foundation for whatever service we are called to provide. James found himself deeply moved by the intimacy and dignity of what he was witnessing. Here was a woman who had faced one of life's greatest challenges and was choosing to transform it into a source of strength rather than retreat. Her words carried the weight of someone who had looked death in the eye and chosen life. Not just survival, but purposeful, meaningful life dedicated to something greater than herself. The ceremony, for that's what James had come to understand it was, concluded with what sounded like a prayer, though he couldn't make out the specific words. He heard the soft sounds of movement within the chapel and quickly stepped back to his appropriate position, ensuring that when the couple emerged, they would find him exactly where protocol dictated he should be. When the chapel doors opened, Catherine and William emerged hand in hand, their faces bearing the peaceful expression of people who had found clarity amidst confusion. Catherine's eyes were slightly red, but her smile was radiant, the smile of someone who had made peace with her circumstances and found a way forward that honored both her struggles and her hopes. James maintained his professional demeanor as the couple walked past him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something historically significant. This wasn't simply a personal moment between husband and wife. It was a redefinition of royal service in the face of personal adversity, a commitment to using privilege and platform for purposes deeper than ceremonial obligation. As the days following this incident unfolded, James began to notice subtle changes in Catherine's approach to her royal duties. There was a new intentionality to her charitable work, particularly in areas related to health and family support. Her public appearances, while still carefully managed due to her ongoing recovery, carried a different energy, more personal, more connected, more purposeful. During a visit to a children's hospital later that month, James observed Catherine spending significantly more time with individual families than her schedule technically allowed. Her staff initially seemed concerned about the delays, but Catherine moved through the ward with such genuine engagement that the logistics seemed to arrange themselves around her presence rather than constraining it. James watched as she sat with a mother whose child was undergoing cancer treatment, and he could see the recognition that passed between them, the understanding that comes from shared experience with fear and uncertainty. Catherine's conversation with the woman was quiet and private, but James could see the comfort and hope that her presence provided, the way her personal experience had become a source of healing for others. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Catherine had always been compassionate in her royal role, but now there was an authenticity that came from having walked through her own dark valley. Her public speaking took on new depth, her charitable work gained sharper focus, and her interactions with both staff and public reflected someone who had been fundamentally changed by adversity. William, too, seemed different, more protective, certainly, but also more appreciative of the ordinary moments of their life together. James observed the small gestures of affection that spoke of a couple who had been reminded of life's fragility and had chosen to cherish rather than take for granted the time they had been given. The summer months brought a gradual return to more normal scheduling, though Catherine's team remained careful to balance public duties with adequate rest and recovery time. James noticed how she had developed new routines. Morning walks in the castle gardens that seemed to serve as moving meditation, afternoon periods reserved for correspondence with families facing similar health challenges, and evening times set aside for reflection and planning her future charitable initiatives. The vow she had made in the chapel that May morning was clearly not forgotten, but was being lived out in practical ways every day. James found himself privileged to witness the daily discipline of someone consciously choosing to transform personal struggle into public service. Someone using their platform not for personal gain, but for the genuine benefit of others facing similar challenges. One afternoon in late June, as James maintained his post during one of Catherine's private meetings with representatives from several cancer charities, he overheard her discussing plans for a new initiative that would provide support for families dealing with serious illness. Her vision was comprehensive, addressing not just medical needs but the emotional, financial, and practical challenges that such families faced. What struck James most profoundly was the personal nature of Catherine's involvement in the planning. This wasn't simply lending her name to someone else's good work. She was drawing on her own experience to shape an approach that addressed gaps she had personally identified during her own journey through illness and recovery. The meeting concluded with tentative plans for a major announcement in 2026, coinciding with what would mark 2 years since her diagnosis. Catherine spoke of returning to Windsor for this announcement as a symbolic gesture, returning to the place where she had made her private vow, now ready to share publicly the commitment she had made in the chapel that spring morning. As summer gave way to autumn, James continued to observe the steady implementation of Catherine's new approach to royal service. Her calendar was rebuilt around initiatives that reflected her personal mission rather than simply fulfilling traditional expectations. Visits to hospitals became more frequent and more personal. Meetings with families affected by serious illness became regular features of her private schedule. Her correspondence grew to include personal letters to individuals facing health challenges, letters that went far beyond the standard royal acknowledgments to offer genuine encouragement based on shared experience. The castle itself seemed to reflect this new sense of purpose. The private apartments where Catherine spent her recovery time had been transformed into something resembling a working office for her new charitable initiatives. James observed the steady stream of meetings with medical professionals, charity organizers, and policy experts who were helping Catherine develop her vision into practical programs. By December, as the castle prepared for the Christmas season, James could see that Catherine's transformation was complete, not in the sense that her journey was finished, but in the sense that she had successfully integrated her personal experience into a renewed sense of royal purpose. The woman who had entered the chapel that May morning seeking clarity had emerged with a mission that would define the next phase of her royal service. The Christmas celebrations that year carried a particular poignancy. James observed the family gathering with a sense of gratitude that spoke of people who had faced the possibility of loss and had been given the gift of another Christmas together. Catherine's joy seemed deeper, more conscious, more appreciative of the simple miracle of family unity. As the year drew to a close, James reflected on the extraordinary privilege of having witnessed Catherine's journey from illness through recovery to renewed purpose. He had seen firsthand how adversity could either diminish or enlarge a person's capacity for service, and he had watched Catherine choose enlargement over retreat, purpose over self-pity, service over self-protection. The vow she had made in the chapel that spring morning was being fulfilled daily through countless small acts of service and connection. And James knew that her promise to return to Windsor in 2026 with a renewed sense of mission was not just a personal commitment, but a pledge to all those who look to the royal family for inspiration and hope in their own times of struggle. Winter settled over Windsor Castle like a quiet blanket, bringing with it a sense of contemplation that seemed perfectly suited to the transformation James Morrison continued to observe in Catherine throughout 2025. The castle's ancient stones held the cold with familiar steadiness, and James found himself appreciating how the rhythms of the seasons mirrored the cycles of recovery and renewal he had witnessed in the royal household over the past year. By January 2025, Catherine's health had stabilized remarkably well, though James noted that she maintained the careful pace and thoughtful approach to scheduling that had become her new normal. Her medical team still made regular visits, but these consultations now focused more on wellness maintenance and energy management than on active treatment concerns. James observed how Catherine had learned to listen to her body in ways she never had before, honoring its signals for rest and activity with a wisdom that spoke of hard-won understanding. The new year brought with it intensive planning for what Catherine had begun referring to privately as the Windsor Return, the comprehensive launch of her health advocacy initiative that would mark the 2-year anniversary of her diagnosis and treatment. James had become an inadvertent witness to the evolution of this project as security arrangements required him to be present during many of the planning meetings that took place within the castle's private apartments. What impressed James most was the thoroughness and authenticity of Catherine's approach. Rather than simply attaching her name to existing programs, she was building something entirely new, informed by her personal experience, but designed to address systemic gaps in support for families dealing with serious illness. The project had grown from her chapel vow into something that would reshape how the royal family engaged with health-related charitable work. Dr. Sarah Phillips, who had become not just Catherine's physician, but also a trusted advisor on the health initiative, was a frequent presence at the castle throughout the early months of 2025. James often saw her arriving with thick folders of research and policy papers, ready to spend hours with Catherine reviewing everything from treatment protocols to family support systems. Their meetings had evolved from medical consultations to collaborative sessions, where Catherine's experience as a patient informed Phillips's expertise as a healthcare professional. During one such meeting in February, James overheard Catherine expressing her frustration with the isolation that many families experience during health crises. She spoke passionately about how the traditional approach of maintaining privacy around illness, while well-intentioned, often left people feeling completely alone in their struggles. Her vision for the new initiative included creating networks of connection that would allow families to support each other while still maintaining appropriate boundaries. William's role in supporting Catherine's mission had become increasingly visible to James throughout the winter months. Rather than simply being a supportive spouse, William had taken on significant responsibilities in the practical development of the initiative. James observed him participating in meetings with legal advisors about the foundation structure, consulting with communications experts about the public launch strategy, and working with security teams to ensure that Catherine's increased public engagement around health issues could be managed safely. The partnership between Catherine and William had always been strong, but James could see how their shared experience of facing her illness had created a new level of collaboration. They approached the health initiative as true partners, with William handling many of the logistical and administrative aspects, while Catherine focused on the programmatic and personal elements. It was a division of labor that played to their individual strengths while advancing their shared commitment to meaningful service. As spring returned to Windsor in 2025, Catherine began making more frequent visits to the private chapel where she had made her vow the previous year. James noticed that these visits had taken on a new character, less about seeking comfort or clarity and more about expressing gratitude and seeking guidance for the work ahead. Sometimes she visited alone, sometimes with William, and occasionally with their children, who had been gradually brought into understanding of their mother's mission as age-appropriate ways. The children's involvement in Catherine's health advocacy had been carefully considered and thoughtfully implemented. James observed family meetings where Catherine explained to George, Charlotte, and Louis how her experience with illness had taught her important lessons about helping others who were facing similar challenges. The children's questions were direct and sometimes surprising, but Catherine answered them with honesty that helped them understand both the seriousness of her mission and their potential role in supporting it. By summer 2025, the infrastructure for Catherine's health initiative had taken substantial shape. The legal framework for the foundation had been established, initial funding secured through a combination of royal family resources and donations from individuals and organizations who had learned of the project through discreet channels. James had observed numerous meetings with potential partners, hospitals, research institutions, existing charities, and healthcare policy experts who would help implement Catherine's vision on a practical level. What struck James as particularly remarkable was Catherine's hands-on involvement in every aspect of the planning. Rather than delegating the details to staff members, she insisted on understanding and personally approving every component of the program. She spent hours reviewing research on best practices in family support during illness, consulting with social workers and psychologists about the emotional aspects of health crises, and meeting with families who were currently navigating serious diagnoses to ensure that her initiative would address real rather than perceived needs. The summer also brought increased attention from media outlets that were beginning to sense that something significant was developing around Catherine's approach to her royal duties. James noticed additional security measures being implemented to protect the privacy of her planning meetings, and he observed how carefully Catherine's public appearances were managed to maintain appropriate boundaries around the details of her upcoming announcement, while still allowing her to engage meaningfully in her current charitable commitments. During a particularly memorable visit to a children's hospital in July, James watched Catherine spend nearly an hour with a family whose situation closely mirrored her own experience the previous year. Her conversation with the parents was quiet and private, but James could see the immediate impact of her presence, the way their shoulders relaxed, how their expressions shifted from worry to hope, the visible relief that came from speaking with someone who truly understood their circumstances. After that hospital visit, Catherine was unusually quiet during the drive back to Windsor. James observed her staring out the window at the countryside, her expression thoughtful rather than sad. When they arrived at the castle, she went directly to her study and spent the remainder of the afternoon working on what he later learned were personal letters to families she had met during various hospital visits over the past months. This practice of personal correspondence had become a regular part of her routine, a way of maintaining connection with individuals whose stories had touched her during public engagements. August brought intensified preparation for what Catherine had designated as her year of return, the period leading up to her major announcement in 2026. James noticed an increase in media training sessions, strategy meetings with communications experts, and careful consideration of every public appearance between now and her Windsor return. The goal was to gradually build awareness and anticipation for her health initiative without overwhelming public interest before she was ready to launch it properly. The communication strategy was particularly sophisticated, designed to honor Catherine's commitment to authenticity while managing the intense public interest that any major royal announcement generated. James observed meetings where every potential question was anticipated, every possible misunderstanding addressed, every detail of the rollout carefully choreographed to ensure that the focus remained on the initiative rather than on Catherine's personal medical journey. September brought a significant milestone when Catherine completed her first full year of active royal duties since her treatment. James marked this anniversary quietly, reflecting on the journey he had observed from his unique vantage point, as someone who had witnessed both her most vulnerable moments and her most determined ones. The woman who had emerged from her health crisis was recognizably the same person, but fundamentally changed, more purposeful, more connected to the essential meaning of service, more committed to using her platform for genuine good. The autumn months were characterized by what Catherine privately called testing phases, smaller-scale implementations of some aspects of her health initiative designed to work out practical issues before the major launch. James observed pilot programs being run in selected hospitals and communities, with Catherine personally reviewing feedback and adjusting approaches based on what was and wasn't working effectively. One particularly successful pilot program involved creating support networks for families of children with serious illnesses, providing not just emotional support, but practical assistance with things like transportation, childcare for siblings, and navigation of complex medical systems. Catherine's personal involvement in developing these programs was evident in every detail. From the training materials for volunteers to the physical spaces where families would meet to the follow-up procedures that ensured ongoing support rather than one-time assistance. October brought the first semi-public hints about Catherine's upcoming announcement, carefully managed through strategic conversations with selected journalists and gradual inclusion of health advocacy themes in her existing public engagements. James noticed increased interest from royal correspondents, but also observed how skillfully Catherine's team managed information flow to maintain appropriate levels of anticipation without premature exposure of details. The approach to public communication reflected Catherine's commitment to authenticity while respecting privacy boundaries. Rather than creating artificial mystery around her announcement, her team was gradually building understanding of her evolution as a working royal who had been personally affected by health challenges and was now ready to channel that experience into public service. The messaging was honest about her journey without being exploitative of her personal struggles. November brought final preparations for the logistics of Catherine's 2026 announcement, including detailed planning for the security, media management, and coordination with partner organizations that would be involved in the launch. James found himself briefed on expanded security protocols that reflected the anticipated high level of public and media interest in Catherine's return to Windsor for this significant announcement. The security planning revealed the scope of what Catherine was preparing to undertake. This wouldn't simply be a single announcement, but the launch of a comprehensive initiative that would reshape her royal duties around health advocacy while maintaining her other charitable commitments. The logistical complexity reflected the ambition of her vision and the thoroughness with which she had prepared for this moment. As 2025 drew toward its close, James reflected on the remarkable transformation he had witnessed over the past 2 years. Catherine's journey from illness through recovery to renewed purpose had been extraordinary to observe, but perhaps even more impressive was the discipline and determination with which she had prepared for her return to Windsor. The vow she had made in the chapel in May 2024 was being fulfilled through countless hours of planning, preparation, and personal growth that had transformed a private commitment into a public mission ready to launch. December brought a sense of anticipation that was almost tangible within the castle walls. Catherine's final medical clearance for increased public engagement had been received, her initiative was ready for implementation, and the detailed plans for her Windsor return were complete. James could see in Catherine's demeanor the confidence that came from thorough preparation combined with genuine passion for the work ahead. The year ended with Catherine making one final private visit to the chapel where she had made her vow. James maintained his respectful distance, but observed the peace and determination in her expression as she emerged. The woman who had entered that chapel 2 years ago, seeking clarity about her future, had become someone ready to step fully into a new chapter of service, armed with hard-won wisdom and unwavering commitment to using her experience for the benefit of others facing similar challenges. The morning of March 15th, 2026, dawned crisp and clear over Windsor Castle, as if nature itself was preparing for the significant day ahead. James Morrison arrived at his post 2 hours earlier than usual, the weight of anticipation evident in the heightened activity throughout the castle grounds. Today marked exactly 2 years since Catherine's cancer diagnosis, and it would witness the fulfillment of the vow she had made in the private chapel 2 years prior. The castle buzzed with carefully controlled activity as final preparations were made for what had become known internally as the Windsor Declaration, Catherine's formal announcement, and launch of her comprehensive health advocacy initiative. James observed the seamless coordination between various teams, security personnel ensuring appropriate protection for the increased media presence, communication staff making final adjustments to press materials, and household staff preparing spaces for the day's events with their usual impeccable attention to detail. Catherine had risen before dawn for final preparations, and James had observed her taking a solitary walk through the east terrace garden as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her pace was measured and thoughtful, her demeanor reflecting someone who had arrived at a moment of profound personal significance after a long journey of preparation. She paused at the rose garden where she had spent so many contemplative mornings during her recovery, touching the emerging buds with gentle appreciation for their resilience and renewal. William joined her for the final stretch of her morning walk, their conversation quiet but animated as they reviewed the day's schedule one final time. James had watched their partnership evolve over the past 2 years, from supporting each other through crisis to collaborating on a shared mission. And their synchronization this morning reflected the depth of their mutual commitment to what they were about to launch together. At 9 a.m., Catherine retreated to her private apartments for final preparations with her styling team, medical advisor, and personal secretary. James maintained his post outside her quarters, observing the steady stream of individuals who played crucial roles in ensuring that Catherine's public presentation would reflect both the significance of the moment and her authentic personality. The careful attention to detail reflected not vanity, but respect for the importance of this announcement and the people who would be affected by it. Dr. Sarah Phillips arrived at 10 a.m. for a final consultation, though this visit was more ceremonial than medical. Catherine's health had stabilized remarkably well, and her medical team was confident in her ability to handle the increased demands of her expanded public role. The consultation served more as a symbolic marking of how far Catherine had traveled from her diagnosis to this moment of triumph over adversity. The first formal event of the day was a private ceremony in the chapel where Catherine had made her original vow. James was positioned outside as the immediate family gathered for what was essentially a blessing of the work Catherine was about to undertake. The children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, had been carefully prepared for their mother's announcement, and James observed their mixture of pride and nervous excitement as they understood they were witnessing something historically significant. The chapel ceremony lasted approximately 30 minutes, and when the family emerged, Catherine's composure carried new authority. She had moved beyond the uncertainty and seeking that had characterized her chapel visits during recovery into a space of clarity and purpose. Her expression reflected someone who had integrated her personal experience into a larger sense of mission and was ready to share that integration with the world. At 11:30 a.m., invited guests began arriving for the private reception that would precede Catherine's public announcement. James observed the carefully curated group, representatives from major healthcare institutions, families who had been personally affected by serious illness, charity leaders from organizations that would partner with Catherine's initiative, and a select group of journalists who had been chosen for their thoughtful coverage of health-related issues. The reception took place in the state dining room, transformed for the occasion with displays showcasing the research and planning that had gone into Catherine's initiative. James watched as Catherine moved through the gathering with remarkable grace, spending meaningful time with each guest while maintaining the energy needed for the public events that would follow. Her interactions demonstrated the personal connection that had motivated her work. She wasn't simply launching a charity, but sharing a mission born from lived experience. The moment that particularly struck James was Catherine's conversation with the Morrison family, whose teenage daughter had been diagnosed with leukemia the previous year. James watched as Catherine knelt to speak with the girl at eye level, their conversation lasting nearly 10 minutes while photographers respectfully maintained distance. The genuine connection between them was evident, and James could see how Catherine's presence provided both comfort and hope to a family navigating challenges Catherine understood intimately. At 1 p.m., the formal press conference began in the Waterloo Chamber, chosen for its historical significance and appropriate grandeur. James positioned himself where he could observe both Catherine's presentation and the media response, his trained eye noting the heightened attention and respectful engagement of the assembled press corps. This wasn't routine royal coverage, but recognition that they were witnessing something of substantial importance. Catherine's opening statement was delivered with a composure that impressed even James, who had observed her evolution over the past 2 years. She spoke candidly about her health journey without exploiting it for sympathy, focusing instead on how the experience had illuminated gaps in support systems for families dealing with serious illness. Her tone struck the perfect balance between personal authenticity and professional authority. 2 years ago, Catherine began, her voice steady and clear. I received a diagnosis that changed not only my understanding of health and illness, but my perspective on the responsibility that comes with privilege and platform. Today, I stand before you not as someone who has been diminished by that experience, but as someone who has been enlarged by it and who is ready to channel that enlargement into meaningful service. James felt a chill of recognition as Catherine's words echoed the vow he had overheard her make in the chapel 2 years earlier. She was fulfilling her private commitment through this very public declaration, transforming personal struggle into public purpose with remarkable grace and determination. Catherine outlined her initiative with comprehensive detail that reflected the thorough planning James had observed over the past year. The program would address multiple aspects of family support during health crises: practical assistance with logistics and finances, emotional support through peer networks, advocacy for improved healthcare policies, and research funding for better treatment outcomes. The scope was ambitious, but grounded in practical understanding of what families actually needed during their most difficult moments. The media response was immediately positive, with questions that demonstrated genuine interest in the substance of Catherine's initiative rather than mere curiosity about her personal medical details. James observed how skillfully she handled inquiries, providing enough personal context to establish her credibility while maintaining appropriate boundaries around private medical information. One journalist asked about the timeline for implementation, and Catherine's response revealed the extent of preparation that had taken place behind the scenes. Pilot programs were already operational in selected locations. Partnerships with major healthcare institutions have been finalized, and funding commitments secured for at least the first 5 years of operation. This wasn't an announcement of future intentions, but the launch of an initiative ready for immediate impact. The press conference concluded at 2:30 p.m., followed immediately by a public walkabout in Windsor Great Park where Catherine would meet with local families and community members. James accompanied the security detail as Catherine moved through the crowd with energy that belied the demanding morning she had already completed. Her interaction with the public reflected the authenticity that had characterized her entire approach to this initiative: genuine connection rather than performative engagement. During the walkabout, James witnessed several moments that crystallized why Catherine's health advocacy resonated so powerfully. A mother approached with her son who was currently undergoing treatment for a brain tumor, and Catherine's immediate response was to sit on a nearby bench and give them her complete attention for nearly 15 minutes. Their conversation was private, but James could see the impact of Catherine's presence on the family's demeanor, the shift from anxiety to hope that came from speaking with someone who truly understood their journey. An elderly gentleman approached to thank Catherine for speaking publicly about health challenges, explaining that her openness had helped his family discuss his wife's recent diagnosis with their grandchildren. Catherine listened with complete focus, then took time to ask specific questions about their situation and offer practical suggestions for family communication during illness. These weren't scripted royal interactions, but genuine human connections that reflected Catherine's personal investment in the issues she was addressing. The afternoon program included a visit to the local hospice where Catherine announced the first major grant from her foundation, funding for a new family support center that would provide practical and emotional assistance to families dealing with terminal diagnoses. James observed Catherine touring the facility with healthcare professionals and spending time with current residents and their families, her engagement reflecting both personal understanding and professional commitment. The hospice visit concluded with a private moment that James found particularly moving. Catherine spent time with a young mother who was receiving end-of-life care, their conversation quiet but intense as they discussed the woman's concerns about her children's future. Catherine listened with complete attention, occasionally taking the woman's hand, her presence providing comfort that went beyond words or official gestures. As the afternoon gave way to evening, Catherine returned to Windsor Castle for a private reception with the families who had been part of her pilot programs over the past year. James observed this gathering from his security position, noting how different it felt from the formal events of the day. This was Catherine with the people who had directly inspired her mission, families who understood intimately why her work mattered because they had lived the challenges she was now addressing systematically. The stories shared during this reception reinforced the importance of what Catherine had launched that day. Parents spoke about the isolation they had felt during their children's treatment, the financial pressures that had compounded their emotional stress, and the gaps in support systems that had made their difficult journeys even more challenging. Catherine listened to each story with complete focus, occasionally sharing her own experiences when they seemed relevant, always maintaining appropriate boundaries while demonstrating authentic understanding. James was particularly struck by Catherine's interaction with a teenage daughter of one family, a girl who had been treated for bone cancer and was now in remission. Their conversation about the challenges of returning to normal life after serious illness reflected Catherine's deep understanding of the long-term impacts of health crises, the ways they changed people permanently, even when treatment was successful. As the reception wound down around 7 p.m., Catherine took a moment to address the gathered families informally, thanking them for their trust in sharing their stories and their willingness to participate in developing programs that would help others facing similar challenges. Her words were simple but heartfelt, reflecting someone who understood that her platform was meaningless without the authentic experiences of real families to guide her work. The final event of the day was a private family dinner, a deliberate choice by Catherine to end this significant day surrounded by the people who had supported her through her own health journey. James observed the family gathering in the private dining room, their conversation animated and joyful as they processed the day's events and celebrated the successful launch of Catherine's initiative. During the dinner, James overheard Catherine reflecting on the day's events with William and the children. She spoke about the sense of completion she felt and finally sharing publicly the mission she had been developing privately for 2 years, but also about the responsibility she now carried to ensure that her initiative delivered meaningful help to families who needed it. The children asked thoughtful questions about their potential roles in supporting their mother's work as they grew older, and Catherine's responses reflected careful consideration of how to involve them appropriately while protecting their childhood and personal development. Her approach balanced their natural desire to help with realistic understanding of what they could contribute at their current ages. As the evening concluded and the family prepared for bed, Catherine made one final visit to the chapel where she had made her original vow. James maintained his post outside, but he could see through the open door that she was spending time in quiet reflection, perhaps expressing gratitude for the opportunity to fulfill her commitment and seeking guidance for the work ahead. When she emerged from the chapel, Catherine's expression was peaceful but determined. She had completed the first phase of her mission, the announcement and launch of her initiative, but James could see in her demeanor that she understood this was just the beginning. The real work of implementing her vision, supporting families in crisis, and creating sustainable change in healthcare support systems was just beginning. The castle settled into its evening quiet, but the significance of the day lingered in the air. James reflected on the extraordinary journey he had witnessed from his unique position as observer and guardian. From Catherine's initial diagnosis and treatment through her recovery and preparation to this triumphant return to Windsor as someone who had transformed personal adversity into public mission, the story had been one of remarkable human resilience and determination. As James completed his final security rounds of the day, he thought about the families who had attended the reception, the media representatives who had covered the announcement with appropriate seriousness, and the healthcare professionals who would help implement Catherine's vision. All of them had been touched by witnessing someone who had faced life's most challenging circumstances and had chosen to use that experience as a foundation for serving others. The next morning would bring new responsibilities as Catherine began the ongoing work of leading her health advocacy initiative, but tonight, James felt privileged to have witnessed something historically significant. Catherine's return to Windsor had fulfilled her private vow in the most public way possible, demonstrating how personal struggle could be transformed into purposeful service when guided by love, determination, and genuine commitment to helping others. Walking to his car at the end of this remarkable day, James carried with him the image of Catherine addressing the families during the evening reception. Her voice strong with conviction, her presence radiating the quiet authority that came from having walked through darkness and emerged with greater capacity for light. It was a reminder that true leadership often came not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them with grace and using them as foundation for serving others with deeper wisdom and compassion. The story that had begun with a diagnosis, evolved through a private vow, and culminated in a public declaration was really just beginning. But James knew that whatever challenges lay ahead in implementing Catherine's vision, she was prepared for them with the same courage and determination that had carried her through her personal health journey and positioned her to transform that experience in a lasting service for families who would face similar struggles in years to come. As he drove through the quiet streets of Windsor toward his own home and family, James felt grateful for the extraordinary privilege of witnessing human resilience at its finest, and he looked forward to observing how Catherine's mission would evolve and grow in the months and years ahead. The vow made in private had become a public commitment, and the real work of healing, both personal and societal, could now begin in earnest.